Symposium. If you can hear my voice, please clap once. If you can hear my voice, please clap twice. And if you can hear my voice, please clap 3 times. This is the beauty of having 3 young children and what they learn in school. And then they take home and they teach their daddy. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that 73-minute extended lunchtime to connect, not only refuel our bodies, but to make new connections as well. There were 2 observations that I had from that lunch, if I may quickly share. One is a Good Samaritan Award. One of our participants went out and had a flat tire on his bike, and the Good Samaritan stepped up and changed the tire so that at 4 o'clock, that participant can ride home without having to deal with the stress that we all know that can create. And that is Yvonne Garcia of Chico. Yvonne, are you back in the room? I think Yvonne earned a shirt. Yeah, right. Yeah, the bike's flat again. Okay. It turns out Yvonne was also the culprit of the flat. Second, and this is pretty cool news, as I think many of you know, the state of California now has a new director of Caltrans, just started. He's going to join us later today to say a few words. And from what I understand, he personally is very engaged in active transportation as well. I'm going to try to do my best to do justice. I haven't met him yet. I want to do justice to his name, but if you could forgive me if I don't, if it takes me a while to be correct in my pronunciation, but it is Tokes is his first name, Omashakin. Did I get that right? Who am I looking at? Emily? You work at Caltrans, is that correct? Awesome. Tokes Omashakin will be joining us. So if it's okay with everyone, not to cut into any of our panels, but to keep all of you on time, our break after this great panel, we're going to make a 10-minute instead of a 15-minute break so that we can honor you and our webcast participants by still ending at 4 o'clock. Is that okay with everyone? Pinky swear? We're in together? Wonderful. Emily, wasn't there one other item that I was supposed to announce? This is that game show where you can call a lifeline right in front of everyone. There wasn't? Okay. Remember, this has been a 3-way partnership, and I just want to say that again. Our California Transportation Commission, Caltrans, and wonderful people at Sacramento State University as well. So will you join me again in thanking our 3-way partnership? Lori Waters, you were trying to make eye contact. Did I forget something? Yes, we'll ask again. We can only continue to improve as you provide us with feedback. Thanks for all the kind words you've shared, and I hope you'll continue to do that with the 3 partner organizations who put this together. But we also benefit by constructive criticism. You can do that online at the Symposium website, or you can do it real time. In your packet, left sleeve, back document is the hard copy of the survey as well. With that, it is truly a pleasure to shift gears with Tanisha Taylor as the moderator of our next panel. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Tanisha, but it's also in the packet. Very impressive background. A graduate of Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University. Is that Alabama A&M then? Yes, it is. Good. One of our nation's esteemed historically Black colleges and universities. She's a member of the California Planning Roundtable. Her current work is so vitally important from the perspective of the California Transportation Commission because it includes work against the Trump administration's efforts to roll back health-based vehicle emission standards as purported in the ironically named Safe Vehicle Rule. If you don't know more about that, I hope you'll pull Tanisha aside because it is something that I hope we all engage in. Editorial comments over. Please welcome Tanisha Taylor.
Thank you, everyone. Just to start and to say thank you to our esteemed panelists and to the group for being here for such an important discussion about active transportation. One of the things I want to start with, because I'm a believer in a very interactive discussion, is we have just a basic question for you guys, and we'll be using Slido today, and so you see the information on the screen in front of you, but what data/information, because we're talking about the benefits and how we collect data to articulate those benefits. And I'll talk a little bit about why benefits are important and use a little bit of my moderator prerogative to kind of open up the panel with some big picture things. And then the panelists will talk about some of the tools and some of the benefits of those tools that help us collect data. So what data/information are you already gathering to show benefits? And I'll give you maybe 2 or 3 minutes so we can respect the time of everybody and get you out of here on time for this panel as well. And so we're starting to see police reports, bike counts, reducing speed reduces fatalities and crashes, safe routes to school study tallies from Switters. I'll just wait a couple more minutes for everybody to get up there, and our panelists can kind of see some of those things that are coming in as we're talking. And then I'll briefly switch to my presentation and then introduce all of our panelists so we can have a robust discussion. So we've got monthly rat counts at schools, safe routes to schools, police reports, bike ped counts, jobs. And all of these things are important, right? In collecting data, you want to be able to show how the benefits from the projects are incorporated and how the money is really being well spent. So I'm going to go ahead and move away from the poll and open up our PowerPoint presentation. And so we're at beyond the details, considering the benefits of active transportation. And this is a really important panel for us because how many, by a show of hands, have been asked, what are the benefits of your project? How is it helping the community that you serve? It should be all of us, right? How many of you have had that question asked and you didn't have any data to support what you were saying? All of us, right? And so we want to talk about that and how we can help with some of that information. So I'm Tanisha Taylor, the Director of Sustainability at the California Association of Councils of Governments. And so let's talk about it. So why measure the benefits? There's a lot of different goals out there from the state of California and from the regions and the local jurisdictions as well. That would be good, thank you. This is why we have lifelines, right? All right. So why measure the benefits? Obviously, we've talked about equity yesterday. We'll talk about equity again today. But to be able to speak to who's being served by these projects and are we sharing the wealth across each of the different demographics that we're serving. Health, safety, reducing greenhouse gases, and protecting the air, as well as the economy. And those are just a few. I could have put 20 different things on the slide because we all have different objectives depending on where the product is in our community and how we're meeting those. So why measure the benefits? That's why we're really here to talk about why measure the benefits and going beyond the data to tell that story that needs to be told. And there's a reality here is there are questions being asked from the legislature, there are questions being asked from your local city councils, there are questions being asked from your board of directors, and there are tough decisions ahead. We have finite resources. We can't fund everything. And so how do you articulate which decisions are the best, which decisions are the most cost effective? That's the data that we collect. And so I just wanted to have a quote because I like quotes. And let's talk about what data does, right? And so this is a street in San Francisco, and they said 2/3 of merchants said new bike lanes had a positive overall impact on their business. That's all supported by data. It's before data, it's after data. But it helps tell a story. It helps tell a story to your city council, your elected officials, to everyone who's asking the question of how do I make those tough decisions about how to spend resources? So how do you get info? And we have an esteemed panel to talk about this here today. And I'll introduce them so you know who they are. Give me just 1 second. And so we have Dylan Finch, who is the co-director of the Bicycling Plus Research Collaborative at the Institute of Transportation Studies from UC Davis. His research focuses on bicycling, attitudes, and behavior, emerging micromobility services, and on transportation planning and policy. We have Neil Maislich from UC Davis. Neil has a PhD, an MPH is an epidemiologist. what a word, with over 30 years of experience in research methods, statistics, and health informatics in government, academia, unions, and healthcare organizations. He currently is a visiting researcher at the University of California, Davis, where he models the health co-benefits of active transportation as a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. He is also a senior research scientist at the Public Health Institute, focusing on the development of healthy community indicators. We have Julia Griswold. Julia is a researcher at the University of California, Berkeley Safe Transportation Research and Education Center, SafeTrek. She recently led the development of the first statewide pedestrian exposure model for the California State Highway System and worked with a team to develop the National Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety Data Clearinghouse, an online resource which contains nearly 4,000 data sets relevant for safety studies. She holds a PhD in transportation engineering from UC Berkeley. We have Jeannie LePage from Ecology Action. Jeannie LePage is the primary fund developer for Safe Routes to Schools, education, encouragement, and planning work for Ecology Action. She has decades of experience organizing diverse stakeholders and partners to build and enrich Safe Routes to Schools programs. Jeannie has designed and implemented numerous Safe Routes to School programs and led planning projects that resulted in $2 million of infrastructure improvements. She serves as a statewide representative for schools on the statewide Active Transportation Program Technical Advisory Committee. And then we have Chris Kluth. Mr. Kluth oversees planning and implementation of the regional bicycle network adopted as part of SANDAGS, the San Diego Association of Governments, the MPO from San Diego, $200 million regional bike plan early action program. Chris grew up in Los Angeles and went to school at UCLA, moved to Seattle, and then to Austin, where he got his master's in community planning at the University of Texas at Austin, and went on to be the bicycle program planner for the city of Austin. And so we have our panelists, and so maybe I'll turn it over to Dylan to start us off.
So I have one slide presentation that I hope will, I'll spend 5 minutes on it. Thank you. Is that better? I'll spend 5 minutes on my one slide because I think it'll be a good kind of introduction to, I think, some more detailed presentations to follow. And this diagram here is a conceptual model that we developed at UC Davis in our proposal for a project that's just starting for Caltrans, and that's to develop a tool to help Caltrans evaluate ATP proposals. That is to calculate benefits from proposed projects. But we also hope that this moves beyond just evaluating proposals, but also evaluating those projects in the future, and then evaluating the program as a whole in the more distant future. So I'm a travel behavior researcher, so I'm going to start from the top, and you'll see that to me, everything's all about human behavior. So if we start at the very top, any active transportation project, whether that's a plan or a program or infrastructure project, either changes or doesn't change human perceptions. So whether it's like the slide just before where business owners perceive there to be benefits to their business from a bike infrastructure project, that would be change in perceptions. Some projects may not change perceptions, and those ones fail in the sense. Or maybe they change some people's perceptions but not others. But if we get change in perceptions, then we start seeing kind of cascading benefits. This is just my conceptual model, and so a lot of refinement is needed, but I think it's a good starting point. We were talking about safety earlier today, and a lot of those safety benefits are perhaps due to very small scale behavior changes. We don't necessarily think about it, but when you narrow a road lane, what you're doing is causing people to drive slower, let's say. And people don't necessarily know that, but there's something about the environment that they perceive that makes them naturally slow down. So those kinds of changes might lead to some benefits, like safety benefits for walking and bicycling. But ideally, active transportation projects are also causing larger scale perception changes that are leading to mode choice changes or reducing driving. And that's where you can see a lot of these arrows stemming from, a lot of the benefits come from that, right? And so this just helps us think about the kind of process of from a project to the benefits. And we've just outlined a few benefits. They're not all of the benefits, but some of the key ones. So safety, which we've already talked about. Accessibility is a benefit in and of itself. If I couldn't walk to the transit station without proper infrastructure, then maybe I couldn't use transit until that project was implemented. The health ones are represented by physical activity and recreation, both physical and mental health. Then we have emissions reductions for both local air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions, and then also economic activity, kind of more indirectly related. So if we think about these as the big ones, the big benefits, the question becomes, how do we evaluate them, which we're going to get to. And hopefully, when we also think about how we're going to evaluate them, we think about who is benefiting. So kind of a cross-cutting issue that we've already spent some time on, and I think needs to be a current theme, which is who's getting these benefits? Are they the people that we want to be benefiting from these programs? And then how long are the benefits? Are these quick-lived projects that are going to be done? We're going to see a little tiny mode shift and then that's it? Or are they starting to really change how people think about how they travel and have longer lasting effects? So with that, I think I'll hand the mic over.
Okay, and next we have Neil Maislich from UC Davis.
Tanisha, yes, I am an epidemiologist, and that does not mean I'm a skin doctor. I study population health and the factors that testing? Not working?
No?
Testing, yeah, it's working, okay.
The teamwork, right?
So I'm going to give context to my presentation. It's really through the lens of climate change and the state's legislation and mandates on state agencies to help reduce carbon emissions in California, to bring them down to goals that would be something on the order of 80% reduction of our 1990 carbon emission levels. I think people are probably aware that the transportation sector has been, for quite some time, the leading source of carbon emissions in California. It accounts for roughly 40% of the roughly 425 million metric tons of carbon that are emitted every year. So obviously the transportation system has an important role in that. Also, it's been stated that climate change is probably the single greatest existential threat to public health, California, throughout the world. So how climate change, transportation, and public health are all linked together is really what this presentation is about. Sort of also in the modeling vein, I have a model too that I'll talk about as well. Dylan showed the three areas of benefits: physical activity, road traffic injuries or safety, and air pollution reduction. And that's what this IFIM model attempts to do. It integrates information about our travel behaviors and the risk factors, which are physical activity, and that's where active travel comes in, emissions, where if we substitute active travel for car travel, especially, because those are the distances that we can cover, short distances, and also the traffic safety element are integrated. It also leverages a lot of the state's investments in data. We talked about the SWITRS data, the California Household Travel Survey data, state vital statistics data, emissions models that the Air Resources Board and others use. So it actually leverages all those data sources in one model to make predictions on the number of deaths that would be prevented if, in fact, active travel became a much more dominant mode of travel by increasing physical activity, by reducing car travel, which means tailpipe emissions, but also a potential harm that may occur through road traffic injuries. In addition to those health outcomes, we can monetize those and also give some insight into what the carbon reductions are. So I'm going to not go into the details of the model itself, that's kind of wonky. You can go to our website, and if you have the slides, the URL of the model itself is at calithim.org/ithim. It's a project sponsored by the Air Resources Board, but carried out by the University of California at Davis. And there's a lot of decision support materials there as well. So I want to give some context. In California, every year, there's roughly 250,000 people who die. Of that, roughly 23,000 people, it's believed that the lack of physical activity was a cause of their death. So that's a lot of people. So that is sort of what the goal, from the standpoint of increasing physical activity. If we can make a dent in that, we would be making a very big improvement in population health. Now, there's a number of state agencies and metropolitan planning organizations that have put out goals for how they see active travel playing out in the population. There's the US Surgeon General, which basically said 150 minutes a week of physical activity is optimum for adults. The scoping plan of the Air Resources Board suggests a 4-fold increase in walking and transit and a 9-fold increase in cycling, which are very ambitious goals. And the MPOs have a different way of going about it. What this slide is illustrating, that of those 23,000 deaths, that the Air Resources Board scoping plan could actually reduce the chronic disease deaths by roughly 8,000 deaths per year. 6,000 deaths per year. The Caltrans plan, which is just a doubling of walking and cycling, walking and transit, and a tripling of cycling, would reduce 2,000 deaths per year. So these are making substantial contributions, as well as the sustainable community strategies. But you can see that the sustainable community strategies is the most modest of all those plans. As far as carbon reduction, and this is an important feature, is that the most ambitious plans, the CARB scoping plan, would reduce carbon emissions by 18 million metric tons per year. And that's a significant reduction compared to some of the other plans. It would make a big difference. So active travel is not just good for you and sort of acute, but as a policy, it could be a very effective way of reducing our carbon emissions. My time is up, but I just wanted to point out that the model itself has been used for policy education at the state legislature. There's a number of other use cases. MPOs are using it to quantify their sustainable community strategies. So this is something that could be built into the infrastructure of our planning so that we can use the health information as a way to drive policy change. And I'll pass it on to...
Thank you, Neil. Next up, we have Julia Griswold. Sorry, Julia.
So I'm going to talk. Is that, okay, that's working. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about counting, and specifically short-term counts and how we can optimize those. And I have some lessons we learned from long-term count data about how we can conduct good counts. So our goal generally when we're conducting counts, or short-term counts in particular, is we want to have an idea of what the activity is at that location. So we're hoping to spend a short amount of time counting and get an idea of what a representative level of activity is at that location. So I have some examples here using some data collected by an automated counter in Berkeley. So this is average automated pedestrian counts at this location, averaged over, I believe, several months. And we can see a typical weekly pattern. So these, we have Monday through Sunday. You see about 3 peaks each weekday. and generally 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. have those highest counts, and they have between 40 and 50 people. And then we have near zero activity at like the early morning hours, maybe 2, 3 a.m. And so this is a fairly typical count pattern that you're going to see. And so if we're looking at collecting short-term counts, here is the same data represented a different way, where I have the coefficient of variation by hour. And so you're seeing a much higher level of variability in those middle of the night hours, and significantly lower, between 20 and 30%, in those daytime hours. So this is representing the relative dispersion at each hour. So these daytime hours are the times when you're going to see less relative variability in your counts, and you're going to get something that's more representative of what that time period is if you do limited counts. And so many of you have probably seen the interim count methodology guidance that's been released for the ATP program. And the ideal thing is to collect automated counts 24 hours a day for 1 week period. But that's not feasible for all jurisdictions. So this alternative approach is to do morning and afternoon peak counts on 3 weekdays, or Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then 1 weekend day count from 11 to 1. And so here we're looking at comparing what the coefficient of variation is for counts at this one site collected during some of these different count periods. So the first block is if we just did counts on 1 Tuesday, 1 Wednesday, or 1 Thursday, not all of them. And you can see at the, oopsie. Well, so the top row, we have an AM peak count, and our coefficient of variation is about 49%. And then midday or PM peak, we have a lower coefficient of variation, so that's better. That's going to be a more representative count. And it goes down for doing a both AM and PM peak. And then if we compare those to 12-hour counts, so that's the 0.13, so that's 13%. So that's going to be a good representation of what that day is going to look like on average. And then the last two lines are what the options are for the interim guidance. So we have a coefficient of variation of 17% for the short-term count option, or 9% for the full week. So that's a good good support for the methods that are currently being recommended by the ATP program. And then, oops, time's up. So I'm going to try to be quick here. I want to talk a little bit about expanding counts, and that's another reason that it's important to have less variation in your time. So you want to have an idea of what your week is or what your year is, and so expansion factors are generally based on the percentage of activity in that time period that's representing the whole week. So here we have, at this spot, 3 p.m. on a Tuesday is 1.2% of the activity. And so if, for example, we have 25 people that we count at that time, you're dividing that by 1.2%. And so that blows up to 2,000. So if your count is off at that time, you have a very small number that you're blowing that up to. And then if you had sort of middle of the night counts that you're trying to expand, that percentage is, much less than 1%. So you're going to have even larger exaggeration of what your count is going to be. And so then real quickly, you want to think about context. So your high volume times are different times of day in different locations. This is downtown Oakland. You have a midday peak, probably when people are going to lunch. This is near an elementary school in Alameda, and you have the peaks around 8 a.m. and 2 p.m., which are probably drop-off and pickup time. And then I'm going to skip my takeaways, but I wanted to mention that counts are not just important for evaluating your one specific project and the benefits and the change of activity there. They are used for understanding what the exposure is when you're evaluating the safety of those projects, and they're used by researchers like me. We used a ton of count data from jurisdictions all over the state to develop the statewide pedestrian exposure model for Caltrans recently. And especially before and after counts can be used in before and after studies when we're evaluating the safety of new types of infrastructure. So there are not a lot of good studies right now on the safety of, say, Class 4 bike lanes. And those are things that are funded by ATP. And so when we get those before and after counts, that's a great source of data for us to evaluate that general type of infrastructure, not just specific projects.
Thank you, Julia. Next we have Jeannie LePage.
Good afternoon. I'm surprised to see so many of you still here after lunch on the second day. Yay. All right. Let's see. Okay. All right. So can I see a show of hands of who here are non-infrastructure implementers? You do education, encouragement, a lot. Okay. Well, that's good. I work for the Ecology Action. We're based in Santa Cruz, down on the Central Coast. And we do, I love the climate connection. That's why we're in the business of active transportation. Our organization is all about greenhouse gas reduction. And so a part of our organization is focused on how can we get that mode shift and get more students and more adults biking and walking. And so historically, we started with SRTS grants a decade ago. Some of you may know that's SRTS funding tool before ATP. And that was when the mode surveys and the parent surveys first rolled out at the Safe Routes to School National Center. So we got those grants, 10, 11 years ago and started using those tools to evaluate our programs. So this is, we do bicycle safety education, pedestrian safety education. We work with our local public health partners, and we do a lot of partnerships with public works jurisdictions in multiple counties. So we bring in the non-infrastructure when they're building all their good projects. And the idea, if you are not a non-infrastructure implementer, is that you are asked to do surveys from the National Center before you do your work to see what the student mode rate is, what the splits are, and to see what parent attitudes are. And then after your project the infrastructure is complete and you've done your non-infrastructure, to then go back again and see have you changed the mode? Have parent attitudes changed? So the rules, not the rules, the tools, sorry. National Center has a data evaluation center. Here's a screenshot of my account. And over the years, we started doing these, I think, back in 2010, and still trying to figure out back then how we would implement them. We actually went to the school sites and did the mode survey counts. You can see there's a list of schools there, and from this data center, you can pull up 2 different time periods, different school districts, 2 different schools, and see if things have shifted, and the National Center will spit out a report. And I can't say enough great things about the National Center. There's a gentleman, Seth Lajunas, and if any of you have, okay, you can call him, email him, and right away he'll go on to your account and help you figure things out. So they're a great resource. So these are the kind of the tools of the trade for non-infrastructure. The first one's the parent survey, and the second one is the student mode survey. The student mode survey in the middle it's a one sheet, and you're expected to go into a classroom. Show of hands, anybody that's implemented the mode surveys in a classroom? So, okay, how many fifth graders or second graders? It's all self-reported information. You go into the classroom and you present the different modes, and then you're asked by a show of hands, okay, how many of you rode your bike today? And how many of you came alone in a car? And I'm going to explain what a carpool is to you, and then how many of you carpooled? So when we first started doing these surveys, we went in, if we did a program that served the entire school, like a bike and walk to school event, we surveyed the entire school. We went into every classroom, and I can't even tell you how time-consuming that was. We did paper surveys, and then we'd bring them back, and we would ship boxes to the National Center. They would upload the data, and then we could print out these great reports. And the same thing with the parent surveys. The schools would send them home to parents. We'd collect them and send them. I think in ATP Cycle 2, the National Center's funding really got cut. Oh, we have 1 more minute. Okay. I'll try to speed it up. Anyway, they no longer will input that data. So it really changed how we implemented the surveys. We no longer go to the schools. We ask teachers to conduct the surveys. We also collect 2 days' worth of data on a single day, which is what the mode survey asks you to do. You want 2 days' worth of data. I just put this in here for folks that haven't done the survey work. The National Center has lots of tools and resources, so I encourage you to go online and check out their advice and best tips. This is just a snapshot. We've also, because I think that these tools, they definitely will give you a baseline of what your community is. They'll tell you broad brush differences in your school districts, your communities. So we've used them for our planning grants now as well. So we go in and we'll do the surveys and the parent surveys. So this is return rates. Typically, the National Center says 20% is a decent return rate. We're getting higher return rates, and certainly from elementary schools, you'll see those surveys come back much higher than from a high school, from the parents. So here's my takeaways. I'll have the teachers do it, gather 2 days of data, make sure it's the same weather conditions. And we're now considering getting a sampling of students rather than doing the whole school, just because of the time's sensitivity to it. And also, use your own tools. We have tools, survey tools for all of our programs to see what we do, how we can improve. And so if you don't do that already, I encourage you to do that. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Jeannie. And certainly, last but not least, we have Chris Kluth.
Nice to be here. Looking me up?
Now you want this one?
Switch to the
Why?
the one that doesn't look like it's working, but it is. Okay. So I work for SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments. We are an MPO and an RTPA, Regional Transportation Association. And I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we are the only MPO that actually builds projects. So that gives us a lot of opportunities. Nope? Okay. Well, that's what I always say anyway. So I want to know who else. I want to know who else does it, because maybe we can learn some lessons from each other. So it gives us a lot of opportunities to plan, fund, design our projects. We do lots of regional transit projects. We also do lots of active transportation projects. And so when we were asked to join the panel, we're asked to represent the viewpoint of a project implementer. So I'm going to give a few of our challenges and a few of the ways that we try to address those. So one of the hardest things is the expectations that people have when they ask, what are you going to get when you build this project? Well, you never know, because it might take 5 or 10 years to really accurately measure how many more people are going to be riding or walking than they do now, when there may be nothing there. So there's this issue of that time that it takes to really put together enough data and the right kind of data to give a good answer. And then part of the challenge with that is, the historical bias of being able to, if you're doing a car project, you've got 50, 60, 70 years of data to go, oh, if you do this, you're going to get this kind of result. We don't have that. So, and then that kind of builds on the cultural bias of being able to give that immediate answer, which makes it that much harder. And then also all of that data or lack of that long-term historical data oftentimes gets fed into modeling, which just goes to further kind of make your case that much harder. So some of the things that we're doing, oh yeah, and this is, I have to say, this is one of our transformative projects that we're building on Pershing. Our project manager right here, Chris Kyrett. Connecting downtown to North Park, San Diego's coolest neighborhood, Senator Kehoe. She's not here. My neighbor in North Park. So completely separated bikeway from North Park all the way into and through downtown. It's going to be great. So let's see. So what we did as an agency was we were able to get our electeds to give us a 10-year commitment and $200 million, which is a lot, but once you start getting into building these projects that are designed to lower speeds, not just, we don't have the luxury of doing temporary projects, so we have to build everything out 100%, but we are redesigning roadways for lower speeds with lots of traffic calming. Like this project, our Georgia Mead and Landis, part of North Park, has 18 traffic circles, tons of traffic calming, road diet, all that stuff built into it. So we have that commitment to long-term funding, which allows us much more flexibility to move forward. So as we do these things, we're building a network, and I think that's one of the major things that is a benefit to the way we're approaching it. It's not all these projects that are here, there, and everywhere. We're actually building a project out kind of from the middle in our highest density urban areas. And we will have also integrated, it's also given us a chance to integrate lots of different pieces into our planning and implementation. We do before and after counts. We measure all of these things that are just mode share, bike activity, pet activity, car activity, turning movements, behavior, so we'll do video counts, and we also have a grant program where we're measuring the same things on those types of projects. So befores and afters, we did have a very robust eco counter program that we started with 55 counters that we got from one of the health grants a few years ago. Way too many, lesson learned, way too many. So now we have 10, and we capitalize on the data that we get from those 10 and leverage that to make our other counts more accurate. Real quick, this is all the network, most of the network in our urban area that we're working on now. And that idea of building on the network and how you build the network, your counts go up. You can see along the bottom there over the course of several years in just one area, the counts went up a significant amount. And one last thing on our urban bikeway and the yellow portion, those are our highest priority projects. Over 350,000 people live within a quarter mile of those. So once that network is completed, probably within about 3 years, we think, we expect to be able to get a lot of good data and a lot of good ridership. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to turn to our question section and give the panel a hand while I do a couple of things. And so just a couple of things while make sure we all are using Slido to put our questions in, including those watching from the web. But maybe a couple of questions for the audience as well as the group before we get to the Slido questions is that we're talking about data, and I know the first time I started working with data and I had to manage a travel demand modeler, and mind you, I do not have a degree in mathematics, and I am not a data person. And so when you talk about data, how many of you guys have worked with data? I know all of you have. How many of you guys have gotten the data and said, what do I do with this? How do I use it? How do I tell a story about it, right? How do I educate my elected officials that this data is meaningful? And I want to take what everybody said here. There's a common thing amongst all of these. They've either turned it into a map, they've turned it into a picture, they've turned it into a soundbite that people can understand. And that's important to recognize when we're talking with data. Because if we say, hey, we had bike ped counts and here's the number, it makes a lot more sense when we say we've had an increase of X number of pedestrians on the facility and we've had an increase in economic vitality of this to an elected official. And thinking about those things and how you tell the story so that it becomes a meaningful piece of information to who you are trying to articulate it to is so valuable in this discussion. When we talk about travel demand models, we're going to have an A through 100,000, 1 through A through ZZ spreadsheet. And looking at that spreadsheet means nothing to most people. But how you turn that into something meaningful, how you turn that into a visual or something that people can remember and resonates with the values that they have within themselves, that's how you start to sell ATP projects. That's how you start to help people make the tough decisions that you are asking them to make. So with that, I will go to the questions. I have a question for the panel while you guys are typing up your questions for them. So for our panelists, is equity only a concern in project selection, or should it also be an important measure within a project?
I guess maybe I should start because I think I thought of this question a while ago. And I'm not too familiar with the ATP program, and so I've been learning a lot about how it's operated in the past and how it could be better. And when you read the statutory requirements, it's not super clear. But then if you step back and think about, well, what's the point of ATP? And from a big perspective, of course, the project should be helping those in need most, right? So I'm not sure. I know it's a major challenge, but it seems like even if it's not statutorily required, that should be the goal of ATP.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Neil?
I'll take this, I don't think it's an either or. I think both
Yeah.
project selection and evaluation or planning, the equity be part of both of those processes. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So that would be my take on
I
things.
agree. I agree. So to Slido, the first question we have, how do you evaluate accessibility and connectivity? 1/4 of a mile is often used for looking at distance to transit/activity centers. Is this still correct or valid? Got some really thought-provoking questions. Any thoughts on how you might measure accessibility and connectivity through some of the tools you've used or some of the counts that you have and how you talk about those things and what the importance of those benefits are?
So we're redoing our regional plan, and a lot of numbers are being thrown around. And, I mean, a 1/4 mile, depending on where you are, could be great. A 1/4 mile in another place could be impossible. So I think if you are just putting this numeric value on it, you're not really getting a very good measurement of accessibility. So I think it has to be given more context than that, just at the very least.
Any other thoughts from our panelists? No? Okay. I'm going to rotate. I think we have roaming mics in the room because I know some people like to participate simply by raising their hands as well. I think I saw a hand out in the audience as well. I think we have a question right here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm St. Francis School Coordinator for the City of Davis. I'm currently doing the teacher tally surveys and typing them in. And one of the students, a fifth grader, mentioned that he and friends take Uber or Lyft. Should that be a part
Uh-huh.
more modern. And the other question I had was, with, you had the red flag warning this past week when we did our teacher rally, and then also 2 years ago, we had Napa fire, and that doesn't seem to be taken into account in the surveys. What are your thoughts on this?
I would say in terms of, is there no flexibility when you could administer the surveys? It would seem like the red flag is just that changes everything, honestly. And you have to compare apples to apples. You wouldn't do a rainy day and a sunny day, and you'd have such different results. So if you have the power to be able to change when you implement the survey, I would certainly lobby for that. And in terms of making changes to that national tool, I kind of doubt that that's going to happen. I would encourage you to, I know lots of jurisdictions kind of do their own survey. I mean, the benefit of using the National Center tool is that then you can create those reports and you're creating this historical knowledge that's apples to apples. So I think that has a lot of value to it. But I mean, you could anecdotally or create your own tool that would capture that as well to see if that mode shift changes as well.
Any other thoughts from our panel? No? Okay. Maybe I'll go back to Slido. Has anyone tracked VMT reductions from bicycle and pedestrian improvements? To the one right up top there.
There's a recent review by Jamie Volker and Susan Handy at UC Davis on this topic for the Air Resources Board. It's somewhere out there on the website. I can find the URL and share it. But the short answer is very little, but they've developed a tool to roughly estimate VMT reductions for different bike infrastructure types.
Any other thoughts? Maybe I'll add. I know from the metropolitan planning organizations and having worked at a metropolitan planning organization in a prior life, that when we look at congestion mitigation and air quality funding, the California Air Resources Board through their Carl Moyer program has a tool that will help you quantify the VMT reductions from bike ped projects as well as the emissions reductions. So another question in the audience, does anyone in the back corner there? And maybe while I'm waiting for a mic to get to you, I'll read another question from up here. Aren't counting bikes in the bike racks more valid and cheaper than asking students if they have biked?
Good question. We historically have done both, but it's staff intensive. If we're doing that one data collection we did in fall of 2018 where I showed this parent survey returns, that was 46 schools. So to send staff out there and to count bikes, you're not capturing the pedestrian trips as well. I think to do both, if you have the staff time, is probably the best practice. But again, you're just capturing the bikes, you're not capturing those pedestrian trips.
And back in the corner here?
Tyler from Tuolumne County. This question is for Chris. Chris, we don't have any counters in Tuolumne County, and I thought I heard you say you have way, way, way too many. Just wondering if we can work out a deal afterwards.
That's an interesting proposition. So one of the things I didn't mention was because there are 55, they're getting better, but they're pretty hard to maintain. And maybe if you have like your public works guys, you can train them to go out and monitor and maintain them. But 55 throughout San Diego region was a lot. Actually, right now, San Diego State has taken on the responsibility of like 40 plus of them. They're trying to get them back up to speed. I'm not sure we have any just sitting around, but maybe we could send me an email and maybe something, I don't know.
And I think we have a question right here, or maybe a follow-up comment.
No, I wanted the panel's comments, is this on?
Yes.
On the natural limits of physical counters or manual counts and what the panel's perspective is on third-party data sets that could help scale some of this across more sites and, fuse the data to actually kind of get the insights at scale.
Don't all jump at once.
I think there's promise with some of the third-party data sets, but they're not really ready yet. I guess I don't really want to name names, but the different sources that we've looked at, like using GPS tracking for cycling apps or even just GPS traces, those big data sets. The data that we've looked at doesn't always make sense. So I think those aren't really ready to be used in the real world.
So I guess I'll follow up on that, and that, yeah, I think the first step needs to be third-party validation. So some of these companies will say, well, we can estimate bike ped volumes and we can do all this, but a lot of it hasn't been validated yet. So that's what I think is needed first, before we can trust that, whether it can even supplement counts or whether it can act in lieu of counts.
There's also, I think, probably some equity issues with those data sets because there are disparities, I'm assuming, in who has smartphones. And so especially for non-motorized modes, you are not necessarily capturing all of the activity. And especially with the apps that are, that people turn on and off to record their trips, you're only recording certain types of trips necessarily. It's probably less likely to capture commuters or people who are not as excited about, collecting their own data or having their data used in the real world. So.
Okay, and maybe I'll go to the third question on our list on Slido, since we're talking about the availability of data and some of the biases. And so do you have a sense that social acceptability biases play a role in student travel tally responses, especially kids who don't bike but say they do? And I think we can open this up to cultural biases as well in terms of just how people view biking and walking from multiple aspects that are not just the physical ability to do so.
For sure, when you're in a classroom and trying to lay out the modes and then you see the hands go up, it's just natural that kids will want to raise their hand when the majority of the class is raising their hand in a certain way, or they'll put them up twice. So there's a lot of peer pressure, I think. And that can be a social equity. It can just be that social norming and wanting to be invisible in the classroom. You don't want to stick out if you're that extra hand that takes the bus, and most kids aren't taking the bus, for instance. I think there's definite problems about using that self-reporting data, especially asking children to do that. And so when we have data sets from the parent survey tallies that have mode information, and we have the student tallies, and they differ, because sometimes they're drastically different, we definitely take the parent surveys, that they are a more reliable source.
Thank you. Any questions from in the room? Oh, we have a microphone right here.
Hi, yes, good afternoon. My name is Victoria Custodio with the California Department of Public Health. And I just wanted to ask this question of Dr. Maislish. So one of the things that the Active Transportation Program's Technical Advisory Committee has been wrestling with is how to evaluate the health impacts of the ATP program. We've talked about, CDPH has talked to you specifically, because you used to actually be in our shop, which was wonderful, about the possibility of using ITHM, other modeling tools to actually do that evaluation. We realize now that that's not the way to go about evaluating the health impacts. Can you speak to what you think would be, considered a good way to actually assess the health impacts of these investments, because it is part of the accountability. We want to make sure that we're doing it in a sound way.
That's a pretty tall order. But I can share some of my thoughts. One, and I've said this before, that you need to build evaluation into the front end of programs. Many funding programs operate that way, that there has to be part of the application process, what it is you will do to evaluate the project. The ATP program has some built-in limitations because many of the outcomes, the health outcomes, will occur after the funding cycle. So that poses additional challenges to the designers of that program to think through how one might collect data during the project period that's not perishable, that would be accessible, so that other evaluators, could be universities or other entities could pool data together in a way that makes sense. There's also other approaches that you might think of. I'm thinking about in public health, there's certain programs that have demonstrated efficacy. So take the nurse partnership program, which is really trying to improve the health outcomes of both the children and the moms in low-income families. And this is a program in which the model itself has been validated in clinical trials, and it actually has a typology. So if you actually can find programs that in which you've invested a lot of time and effort to demonstrate their efficacy, and it may require long-term follow-up. It may be that you will be able to pick up short-term health outcomes like changes in blood pressure or body mass index, maybe not the heart attack or some other long-term health effect. But if you can identify, in well-designed programs, and then have, when an applicant comes forward with a particular project, you can have some sense of what the effect measure of that particular project, which is going to be a smaller version of that. And also say, in the sense that, can the applicant stay true to the model? So, because many times the model is fine, but the execution is problematic. So this is an approach that we use in public health. The alternative is the idea of evaluating hundreds of small projects. It's just not feasible. I mean, I don't think and it may not be cost effective. The big picture, which is the modeling work that I do, basically says that any level of active transportation, I mean, we've become such a sedentary society that any level of physical activity is going to improve population health. And where we are on the dose response curve is just a little bit of physical activity on a population basis goes a long way to reducing chronic diseases. So from that standpoint, if you know that the overall picture is positive for active transportation, but you need to have specific programs so that the investments, there's some guarantee that the investments are really worthwhile. So what I'm saying is sort of a staged approach. We may need to invest a lot more in specific programs to come up with those typologies, those kinds of programs, what their effect measure is. I know there's a white paper that Susan Handy wrote about many different strategies in California, specifically around greenhouse gas reduction. That kind of idea, so that you'd have where your project is in the spectrum of impacts, and use that, and then the evaluators in the application say, do I think they can actually stay true to the model and execute it all the way through? That may be a way to grapple with this.
Okay. So I'll go back to Slido. So what count data or resources are available? Actual counts aren't always possible. Is there a database or another resource for counts across the state?
I don't know of any statewide databases. I know UCLA and SCAG have a database that the last time I checked mostly applied to Southern California. So that had a lot of bicycle and pedestrian count data. And then I would love to see a statewide database of counts, but I think I don't know of any concrete plans for anything statewide, so it's mostly sort of ad hoc by different agencies, and then those are really only shared by request.
Any questions?
Yeah. Rosie Masterhazy, Palo Alto Safe Routes to School program. So in Palo Alto has been collecting safe routes to school data since the 80s. Travel tally data, bike count data, parent survey data. And I've been a part of that project since like about 2007 when Christine Vogt from Michigan State University actually launched the travel tally that you see there. So there has been such an evolution in the modes and since then, just as someone spoke about, whether it's scooters and skateboards or e-bikes. So we conduct our own surveys now because there is such a change in our community that to ask questions like, would you choose to let your kid walk or bike to school if you, la da 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 da? It's like in Palo Alto, so many parents are doing that already that it's kind of a leading question to even suggest that. So we conduct our own surveys, because I think we feel it's more important to just evolve and get the really important information, like how many kids are actually, using, or I also wanted to speak to stigmatizing, that there was an issue about stigmatizing kids who use the bus, the VTP students who are commuting, and so we had to work on the semantics and actually change that around. There's a lot of sensitivities in the classroom to conducting surveys and getting people on board for it. I also did want to say that bike counts are great ways to ground truth your travel tally data, get a sense of the number of kids who said they biked versus how many kids biked, how many bikes are in the racks. If you can't get to every school or you have like weird overlapping jurisdictions in your school district, you can work with the PTA and ask the PTA presidents at each school potentially to like do a bike count and just send it in. Just one day when they're dropping their kid off, just count the number of bikes in the rack. So at all but some of the most crazy bike intense schools, that's a good way to ground truth your travel tally data. I also just wanted to say, this information, again, in Palo Alto, we have a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2030, and there's all these ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, but it seems like, the time that it's going to take for the culture shift to happen, to get us anywhere near those goals, it's not aligned. What it's really going to take to meet a lot of these ambitious goals. I feel like we're already going to be 20 feet underwater before we really move people. And I don't know whether it's disheartening or demoralizing, but stating the reality of the facts that single occupancy vehicles are the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions, that vehicles are, passenger-based vehicle collisions are the #1 cause of mortality for kids ages 5 to 18. These are shocking goals that people, they're not even able to process, it seems like. So what is your thought around, how this data, whether this data is just demoralizing or people shut it off, or what does it take to get people to tune in and actually use this data? Because I feel like people look at me like I'm on another planet when I try to share this information sometimes.
I'll take that because I grapple with that too. And my chart shows that, the existing strategy for land use around SB 375, that, we are going to be 200 feet underwater by the time business as usual plays out. That the scoping plan goals from the Air Resources Board would make a huge dent in both population health, and it would achieve a pretty big mode shift. It's really incumbent on the state agencies that propose these goals to come up with the plan. Leah talked about it this morning, that we throw out almost gratuitously these very noble, wonderful goals. But who has reversed engineered what it would take, including what the cost implications are? MPOs, they create goals as part of their strategy, and then they select a complement of projects that would achieve those goals. Why isn't that happening at the state level? And we are talking about massive investments in all the different strategies. Right now, a lot of what the strategy is electrify the auto fleet. And what my data shows is that active transportation is a part of the solution. It's not cute from a greenhouse gas. It can be effective if it's brought up to scale. But it's really incumbent upon the state agencies to say, these are the kinds of projects. These are the kinds of policies that we would like to promote, and active transportation would have to be part of that. During the first scoping plan the ARB put out, there was not a specific goal assigned to active transportation. If there had been, we could start a process by which How can we monitor and see how we're achieving that? So there's a disconnect there between this particular strategy and a strategy that might ultimately lead us in a very different place. It may have very little health benefit. The ITHM modeling suggests that the air pollution reductions compared to the physical activity improvements are really tiny, really tiny. So policymakers have an option of which policies to pick. If they're consciously picking policies that will have very little health co-benefits, that's really a shame. It'll be one of the biggest public health lost opportunities in our lifetimes if that happens. So we need to have the advocacy groups and everyone else point this out and make the policymakers accountable. They propose the goals, they need to come up with the projects that would achieve those goals.
Thank you, Neil. I might add just one thing to what Neil has stated, and I kind of concluded our panel with this after the presentations, is that when we talk about data, and we're talking about how we articulate it to the public and how we articulate it to our elected officials, how you say what you say matters. You have to speak in a language that people understand. You have to speak in a language that speaks to their hearts and what's valuable to them. And if we miss those two things, the public will not listen to us because they're looking at what matters to me, how does this impact my everyday life? And if we can do it in pictures, maps, words, whatever resonates with the communities we're talking to, we will have a much stronger impact in getting towards our goals. But I'm going to go to slide one. I know I've got a microphone over you, so I'll come up to you after this slide of question, okay? So do you think there's a double standard, and I'll say maybe challenges, in the extent to which active transportation projects must justify their benefits with limited data relative to auto-centric projects? And I know several of you have talked about the challenges of having limited data and being able to say what the impacts of a project in the future are. So maybe you guys can just elaborate on some of the things that you've already started talking about.
Start. Yes. We're talking, Ariana Green did a presentation, she's going to be speaking later. We're talking massive behavior change, and the Vision Zero presentation about, and Neil talking about at the state, if we don't have the political will and the infrastructure to, get people, they're not going to shift their mode. And, we can do our education and our encouragement and create these projects, but if there isn't massive, massive support and leadership for mode shift, I just feel like, yeah, it's a really tough. We try to do our best to evaluate all of our programs. We evaluate our instruction. Did children learn more at the beginning from the end? And there's only so many ways you can deal the cards, right? But mode shift it's such a high bar. And if that's the only bar that we're held to, it's a big shift.
Not to mention that for car projects, it's, level of service. So easy to measure, easy to show an effective before or after in the near term, and then people forget about it. And then a couple years later, congestion's back. We haven't done anything. We've just added capacity and continued on the same path we're on. So, yeah.
I'll try to, a little bit of a repeat of what folks were saying yesterday, but I'll try not to say the wrong thing. If we're measuring the results from ATP and the grants, clearly you're never, and if that's your measure and that's what you're going to be held to as a measure of success, you're never going to get there. You're never even going to get close. So the relatively small amount compared to the bigger pot from ATP, even though it's, way better than it was, we can't rely on these grant programs to be the sole funding source for these types of projects. These are not optional projects. That's what makes me so frustrated. They are not optional. Everyone should have the right to go where they want to go without having to drive and get there safely. It's just crazy that a lot of the way regional, state, and local jurisdictions fund these projects is, well, we'll do that if we get a grant. Do you need to do it? It's like, where are the priorities? when is the funding going to follow the priorities of not just GHG, but safety and all of these other social equity issues? It's completely backwards. And so, I mean, that's where the top rung on the chart this morning at the legislative and policy level, I mean, that's where you have to hit hard. And the trickle up, it's good to have all that, but I mean, if you really need the sea change, you got to hit it hard from the top.
In the front here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my name is Mary Jo Gellenbeck. I'm actually in from North Carolina to learn a little bit of what you guys are doing.
Get a shirt.
Oh, yeah, thanks. So I categorize active transportation as a microtransit, and I'm wanting to know if partnering up with the data for mass transit could increase possible funding. If mass transit is seeing ridership go up, it's got to be because the active transportation is linking them to it. So I was curious about data on mass transit services and ridership going up.
Any thoughts? Neil, do you want?
I mean, in the ITHM model, we actually model that. So many of the MPOs in California, their main strategy for greenhouse gas reduction is large transit projects in their regions. And when you compare that to minutes per day of travel, and if you have the choice of going walking, cycling, or transit, you can quantify the health benefits. You can also quantify the road traffic injuries as well. So yeah, you definitely get a benefit there, but it's for an equal time, biking or walking, you will get more health benefit. So if you rely on transit exclusively for a health goal, you're going to fall short compared to other options that are available. We have more than health goals to meet, so that may not be the only criteria, but putting all our eggs in the transit basket is not going to be as effective as especially large increases in bicycling infrastructure, because you cover more ground, you have much more VMT reduction in that strategy, and you actually get a lot more health benefit. So from the standpoint of, again, different policy options, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but if you have the choices of where you're going to invest money, a more balanced portfolio where there's going to actually be more investment in bike and walk modes, independent of transit, but also invest in transit, will be sort of a happier medium. So.
Yeah, isn't it kind of like I'm kind of referring to like a partnership. So the two partners work collaboratively.
Sure, yeah.
To pool their resources so that you are making that progress. Because you can only go so far on bike. You have to go greater distances.
Right.
And so you connect those two. So I'm wondering if there is data on that industry that could be collaborative with ATP.
You're talking about data on how frequently people walk and bike to transit, or?
No.
Well, can I maybe try to re-articulate what you're saying, just to make sure I understand it for myself, and maybe help kind of the discussion? It sounds like what you're asking is there's clearly a connection between when you are walking to, say, a transit facility, and there is a connection between getting on the bus, and the more you increase that pedestrian travel or the bicycle travel to that transit facility, there is a connection. And are our public works and our community development departments, or are our state programs in those particular places, are they aligning and talking about how to collect data that shows the benefit of that and the benefit of aligning those funds as you're delivering those types of projects? Is that kind of what you're asking to?
Yeah. Basically, is ridership going up as the funding for ATP going up? You finding those links? And if you are, then you have several departments that are working together on what's on goal.
I think one of the things that's happening right now that's challenging in most of the regions of California is that ridership is declining. across most transit services. And so we're not seeing an increase, even though there may be a fundamental increase because of that connection you're talking about. It's not an increase that is overcoming the decline in ridership that is happening for various reasons. Uber, Lyft, and those types of microtransit services are really having a negative impact on transit to some degree. And so how you tease that out, I don't know that we found that out yet. Yeah, thank you. So I'll go to Slido. I know I've got a mic somewhere in the back there, so I'll come to you next. Vehicle collisions, so passenger-based vehicle collisions are the #1 cause of mortality for age 5 to 18. How do we communicate to parents that kids are often safer on foot than in a car?
How do we
How do we
communicate to parents that kids are often safer on foot than in a car? Good question. I think not only the vehicle collisions, but the stranger danger. There's a lot of reasons why people drive their children to school. They just feel safer. And it's again, it's a cultural shift of getting out of your car, being out in your neighborhood and engaging with your area. So safety would be one, the vehicle collision safety, but also just being out in your neighborhood and getting over fears of the unknown. And we see that a lot, depending on where we're doing the parent surveys, that actually it's in the lower income areas, there's concerns about crime and violence, that's one of the biggest impediments. And in the more affluent areas, we see that the biggest parent barriers are concerns about that a child on a bicycle or walking would be hit by a car. So it's depending on which community you're actually going to and working in, that what would be the tools that you would be able to work with families. I don't know, education, that's the best thing that I can say.
And so in the back.
I put one up on Slido, but I really want to know, so I'm going to ask it. Esther with California Walks. I want to know a bit more about the data and how we're capturing benefits to the actual communities that these projects are built for, and not those that are displacing those communities, and maybe other data that we should be considering similar to that, in that we're actually measuring a benefit to the communities that are intended to benefit from active transportation in these projects.
It's also up on the screen for everyone, so maybe that's the question, right,
I
Esther?
double check it gets asked, so you know.
So what data should we be capturing to measure benefits to the specific communities products are built for, and not for those that displace those communities? So when we obviously sometimes have displacement happen with the types of things that we're doing, unfortunately, and how do we deal with that displacement, and how do we actually capture data for the original residents versus those new residents that may come, maybe might be the question.
Well, from a non-infrastructure perspective, that's what we do. Whatever area we're serving, we would go into those schools and do the parent surveys. And also all the programmatic surveys are serving either the clients, customers, and also the teachers and the principals and folks like that. But from a non-infrastructure perspective, I would ask somebody else. Yeah.
I think it's a tough question, and I think part of it is how you collect the data too, right? And the demographics and identifying who the population served is at the onset of their project and those types of things as you're designing their project as well. I think I have another question in the front, if I can get a mic up here.
John Ciccarelli, Bicycle Solutions, San Francisco. I'm not a parent, but I work with kids. I teach them how to ride a bike, lots and lots and lots of them. I teach some of their parents how to ride a bike at all ages. It seems to me that aren't parents kind of siloed in that you're collecting data from them, but what I've seen in my interactions with schools is that the culture of the school and its interactions with the parents and the degree to which parents have a way to talk to other parents about their experiences, including mode choice, really varies widely. Does the program, the active transportation program, think about how to help parents become more comfortable with mode shift, especially after a major infrastructure intervention has been done that really may make it possible for more of them to make the decision with their heart, not just with their head, because, explaining to them that kids are safer on foot statistically, that's a head thing. Getting them to believe it for their own choice for their own kids, that's a heart thing. Can you speak to that?
Well, again, it goes back to what I said about funding an ATP and the bar. It's such a big shift we're asking people to do, and I think maybe from the communities that you're coming from, like Palo Alto, I don't know, do you serve Palo Alto as well? Because it's a really bike prolific community, right? And the communities that we're serving, it's just different. And so when you're talking about that kind of mode shift, it's attitude change, it's behavior change, and in appealing to parents, it depends. You're absolutely right. Depending on what district or community they're from, it's a really different conversation and a different set of words and language that you would be using as well. So I think I don't have an easy answer, and I think it would be interesting to propose a non-infrastructure project, and we talk about this a lot internally, about reaching parents. Yes, we can do the education in the schools, we can do the encouragement in the community, but actually really having meaningful engagement with the parents, I don't feel like we have a good answer yet, and we continue to talk about it and think about it with our partners, how we really, and I guess I also just will say parenthetically that I often think about travel, behavior, and mode shift. If it was so easy, boy, the anti-smoking campaign would be all done, right? I mean, public health, changing behavior and changing people's what they do on a daily basis, it's such a big order. And with the climate crisis and that kind of, we don't have time anymore, I guess I feel like maybe there's other tools in the toolbox that we can use. But I don't have a good answer, but we do talk to partners all the time and try to figure out, like, let's do a pilot program and see how we can really affect change, because it is going to come from the parents.
So I'll go back to slide one. Maybe I'll go to the second one on the list. And how does the panel feel about pedestrian and bicyclist tracking cameras? Is it possible to integrate these with existing car counting cameras that are more common?
These cameras at intersections? Yes. Yeah, there's some neat thermal cameras out there now that, that just have automated algorithms that can maybe replace traditional counters, but it's still just, counting bikes, peds, and cars. I don't know what the costs are, but it seems promising.
Just real quick, the concept seems appealing, but from what we've seen working with our local jurisdictions is the technology is really not all that it's sold to be yet. So I wouldn't really want to put that out there as something to hang your hat on yet.
Do we have any questions in the room? In the back.
Hi, this is Linda with the California Bicycle Coalition. I work in advocacy at the state level, and I'm feeling a bit angry, so I just want to note that. A lot of great conversation, but a remark that was made around wanting to win the, needing to win the hearts and minds of decision makers, I fundamentally disagree with that based on my experience. I think we need better decision makers. Like that, this data, this has all been said over and over again throughout, the course of a lot of people's careers here, to no end, and stop falling on deaf ears when it's clear what we need to do and the priorities that we need to make. We need grown-ups to be making decisions for the betterment of all of our communities and the health and safety. And so I am not interested in winning anyone's hearts and minds. What I am interested to hear about is how our panelists are actually engaging more with the political process, because what I've experienced is a reluctance to come up to decision makers to share this information, because when it's coming from me as an advocate, I get told, oh, of course you would say that. You represent the very people who would want this. Who are you? Screw you. That's literally what I get. on a day-to-day basis. So, but what I've found is effective, and for example, Dylan's research coming up and an actual researcher coming up and bringing that data to decision makers is much more effective. Or when practitioners come. So how are all of you encouraging and engaging and taking those risks and including that in your work plans and the money that you get? Because I don't get funded for a lot of things that I have to do, but perhaps you do, and maybe what is it that you're doing to make that change?
Can I say a couple things before I turn to them? Just for you?
I'd like to hear the panelists, thank you.
I just want to say I agree with you. And that I encourage everyone to go out and vote, because that's an important part of the process.
Yeah, so Senate Bill, for the research side, Senate Bill 1 has really helped because it's allowed transportation researchers to get funds to study state-level problems. And we now have these quick response projects, which is what Linda was referring to. So the kind of hot topics we can kind of competitively offer grants to try to study these hot topics and then provide short policy briefs that can be used to inform the legislature. So I think that's a big shift. I don't think that happened, that's new. So I think that will help at least bringing the research to decision makers.
I can say this because I'm a former state employee, not a current state employee. But, there's an inside-outside game. Everyone has a role to play. So when I was at the state where I was developing this model, part of what we did was educate our own management, and then at legislative hearings, the findings of the model and the emphasis on active transportation. So it was part of an effort of policy education. Echoes of that, because the Bike Coalition and California Walks and all the other groups that were aware of our findings used it as ammunition in their advocacy work as well. But I share the same frustration that not enough is being done on a timescale that will avoid some of the worst consequences of climate change. So that means that we have to elevate the stakes, because there's no, through political action, because ultimately the decisions are a political decision, and the change is so transformational. We have in this society really deified mobility and individual freedom. We've conflated car ownership with individual freedom, and we're all going to go down together if that is the paradigm we follow. We have to have a transformational shift, and the way we do it really matters. So as other people have said, pedal now or paddle later.
Do we have any other questions in the room? I've got time for about 2 more questions. We have one in the back.
I just have a general question. Americans, they love to drive their car. And, that's one of the things, get the Americans out of their car. Bike and walk, I love it. If it's safe, I'll do it. So how do you get from the mentality, build it and they will come? I mean, if you build everything that's like super great and safe and wonderful, how are you going to get them to walk and bike?
We also have to make driving not convenient. So I think that the biggest deal is it's not so much that you have to get their attitude to be like, yeah, I want to ride my bike. It's about, getting in the car seems like such an ordeal because I have to sit in 20 extra minutes of traffic and I have to pay X amount to park and I have to do, this and that. Or maybe I can't even drive my car to my destination because I now have to park my car on the periphery of the downtown, and the downtown is car-free. Might as well just get on a bike. So I think it's those kinds of big changes, maybe. So a car really becomes, you really have to consider, are you willing to put up with the hassle of driving? Maybe.
I just want to say, I think we have to use every tool in the toolbox, and it's partly well, largely infrastructure, and then partly the education, encouragement piece that I'm occupying today. We need carrots and sticks, make it expensive to park, make it, price of gas needs to go way up. I mean, that's my personal opinion. There's lots of tools, legislatively, public policy, that make it attractive to use other means. The cost of transit, the ease of transit. Where I live, transit just isn't really a great option. So I think it's going to take a lot more heads that are on this stage to be able to make that big paradigm shift. And yeah, I think it is about elected officials. We have a really important election. That's the time, in my opinion, to make those changes.
Okay, do we have one last question in the audience? No? Okay, I'll ask a question of the panel. Is everyone familiar with the Maryland School Project? Anyone up here? That's the next question, so maybe I'll go to the next question in terms of how does your work promote racial equity goals?
Again, this is somewhat of a data response, but as part of the model, we actually took a look at racial equity by stratifying the household travel survey. This Witter's data for serious and fatal injuries are statistics by race and ethnicity. And these data are now available. And it actually has very nuanced findings. I mean, I think, I don't know, I wasn't aware that the California Household Travel Survey had been analyzed by race and ethnicity. If there's people who've actually done it, I hadn't seen it. But there's tremendous differences, as one would suspect, in the mobility patterns by race and ethnicity in California. And this has been pointed out by others, by Sarah Zimmerman and others who worked on that for Safe Routes to Schools nationally with some of their data. So making the data available is part of that. And what the implications are for example, the Air Resources Board scoping plans is really different for the different race and ethnic groups. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that Latinos and Blacks have very different pattern of usage of walking, biking, and transit than whites. Whites have maybe about a 25% overall distance mobility advantage than other groups, largely through tremendous car dependency. So when the state goals are played out in those different race ethnic groups, the health outcomes are actually quite different, where historically disadvantaged African Americans actually benefit more from those kinds of state goals than other groups, which may be in tune with what was said, I guess, in day one about we have to think about rectifying the baseline health inequities or other kinds of inequities. So this is a way, once this is more widely appreciated, people will begin to think through the strategies, both in the planning, execution, and monitoring stages of what the implications are for, in this case, race and ethnicity equity. So making the data available by different race and ethnicities is a very basic way of going about it, and more should be done.
Thank you, Neil. And so I might just wrap it up by saying thank you to our esteemed panelists here. Can everybody join me in giving them a round of applause?
What a wonderfully moderated and thoughtful panel with great dialogue as well, both in the room as well as through our networking online. Thank you all for being so thoughtful about this. A couple of announcements before we transition to a break, and because we were given a few minutes back, this will be easier. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be joined near the end of our program by the new director of Caltrans, new to our state from Tennessee. And his name again is Tokes Omashakin. Did I nail it, Emily? Good. Tokes Omashakin. I have not met Tokes yet, as you can tell from my desperate attempt not to disrespect his name by mispronouncing it, so I will do my best with that. So we're going to take our break in just a moment, but a couple of things. I'm going to put somebody on the spot, and I hope that he won't mind. But for this entire 2 days, never multitasking that I've ever observed, but completely enthralled in learning and in being a part of this process, is the chief consultant for the State Assembly Transportation Committee, Eric Thrompson. And I just wanted to thank you for making that donation of time, which means you get a donation of a racing shirt. Could you stand so that we can thank you? And second, again, I have such respect for people that are in the difficult position of trying to keep time to keep us on time. And Alika, you've done that so wonderfully well today. So thank you. Could you stand so that we can recognize and thank you? Good. Thank you. And with that, we are going to come back, remember, at 2:55 instead of 3, so that we can start our final panel a few minutes early and respect them still getting their whole time as we work in our new director of Caltrans. Thank you. Stretch your legs. We'll see you in 11 minutes.